So now we're moving to Oxford, and I'm more than happy to have Rasmus Kleis Nielsen next to me, director of the Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism. And Rasmus Kleis Nielsen is also a professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. Great to have you here. How's the weather in Oxford?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So you have a study that you can present to us, navigating the infodemic, how people in 6 countries access and rate news and information about coronavirus. So I don't want to talk too much and just let you start with a presentation of the study. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. So really, the starting premise here of this piece of research that I've done with a group of colleagues, and all of this is available on the Reuters Institute website for those who are interested in more details, is a very simple observation, which is that the coronavirus crisis is a medical crisis, but it's also a communications crisis. And we have to understand the communication side of this as much as we understand the medical side of this if we hope our societies to respond effectively to it. If people don't understand the situation on the ground, if they aren't told what they can do to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their communities, and if they don't know what their governments are doing or trying to do or failing to do in response to the crisis, then the public health outcome will be worse than it could have been. So I think it's central just to recognize how important information and news in particular is in this situation. So to better understand the role of news and information, what we've done is a survey of a nationally representative sample of online users in 6 different countries across the world, including Germany, just to understand the relationship between different kinds of news and media use, and then how much people actually know about the coronavirus. And what I want to do today is just to pull out 3 key findings from this study and share just a little bit of detail about each of them, and then take questions. So the first key finding is this. In most of the 6 countries we look at, most people rely on news organizations for news and information about coronavirus. Most people say that they consider news organizations a relatively trustworthy source of information. And in most of the 6 countries, those who rely on news organizations also know more about the coronavirus when we control for other factors like their level of education and political orientation and the like. So it's clear that news makes a demonstrable positive difference here in terms of people's understanding of the crisis. The second key finding I wanted to pull out is that it's clear, of course, that people rely on many other platforms for information as well, including different kinds of digital platforms such as search engines, social media, video sites, and messaging applications. These are very widely used as means for accessing news and information about the coronavirus. It's important to recognize upfront that most people trust these platforms much less than they trust news organizations. And also, we find no consistent evidence that people who rely on these platforms know more, or for that matter, less about the coronavirus. The third set of key findings I wanted to quickly pull out for this presentation is that it's clear that news and information matters, but also important is to recognize that underlying social and political factors matter as well. To take education as an example of a social factor, in almost every country, those with lower levels of formal education know less about the coronavirus than other people in the public, controlling for other factors again. And we think this is in part about the fact that a lot of reporting tend to rely on pretty technical scientific jargon that can be hard to decipher for people who are very smart but don't have the benefit of many years of formal education. Politics matters as well. So in 4 of the countries that we look at, those people who identify as being on the political right know significantly less about the coronavirus than other people do. And in every country, those who say they don't know, when we ask them about whether they're on the left, in the center, or on the right, know much less about the disease than other people do. And our interpretation of this essentially is that in some countries, prominent politicians on the right have been advancing and amplifying different narratives about the disease that are false or misleading. And people who support those politicians, have sympathy for them, trust them, may be misinformed simply because they defer to the expressions from very prominent people who are essentially misleading the public about the disease. And when we turn to people who say don't know, our interpretation of this is that these are people who are sort of a bit disengaged, perhaps even alienated from the political system, and thus don't really know who to rely on. They often also don't trust the news media, and that leaves them without the sort of the cues to interpret the information they come across. These are the 3 findings. I just wanted to pull out a few details of each of them to give people a sense of how we arrived at this and what it might mean for how we think about how we go forward together in the crisis. So first, widely used news media. In almost every country, news is the most widely used source of information about the coronavirus. And while we have a large number of our respondents, for example, in Germany, 44%, who say they rely on scientists, doctors, and health experts for news and information about the coronavirus, I think we can safely assume that very often what people mean when they answer that in the survey, it means that they have seen scientists and doctors and health experts in television interviews or via the social media channels and websites of established news organizations. Of course, there are some who go direct to scientists, or for that matter, to global health organizations like the World Health Organization for information. But I think we can safely assume that they often do that via intermediaries, whether those are news organizations or various platform companies. So in every country, we can see that there are people rely on a variety of different sources of information about coronavirus, but news organizations are very central. We can also see, however, that in every country, somewhere between a quarter and half say that they don't rely on news organizations, which is a reminder that in every country, there is a sizable minority who do not see news media as a useful or trustworthy or relevant source of information, even in a crisis like this. In terms of trust, I've just pulled out Germany and the United States here. We find very high levels of trust in scientists. We find high levels of trust in national health organizations. And then news organizations, governments somewhere in the middle, trusted much more in most countries than individual politicians, or let alone sort of ordinary people, whether these are people that you know in your close circles or strangers that you come across via social media and the like. In terms of knowledge, I'll show a sort of slightly cryptic graph, which is a subset of a regression model that's presented in detail in the report that you can find on our website. But basically, the things to notice here are the factors that are shown to be statistically significantly associated with people knowing more about the disease. In Germany, people who say they rely on information from news organizations, from the government, global health organizations, national health organizations, scientists and experts know demonstrably more about the disease. And people who say that they rely on people that they don't know, so strangers essentially, whether online or offline, know demonstrably less about the disease. And these are sort of broad patterns we find across countries. The news organizations matter. Germany is interesting. It's one of just 2 countries where relying on the government is associated with knowing more about the disease. That's not a consistent pattern. There's only a few countries, the UK and Germany, where we find this. So what about the other platforms that people rely on? It's clear that if we look at various digital platforms, that both search, various social media, and various video sharing and photo sharing sites are very widely used by many people, in particular younger people, very often to discuss coronavirus in closed environments like Facebook groups or on WhatsApp groups. It's important, I think, here to recognize that most people are very, very skeptical of the information that they find via most of these platforms. So looking at the percentage of people who say that they trust these different types of platforms, they are generally much lower than the number of people who say they trust the news media or who say they trust the government. So a simple way to think about this is what we call the trust gap, which is the difference between the percentage of people who rate news organizations a relatively trustworthy source of news and information about coronavirus, and then the percentage of people who say the same about each of these different kinds of platforms. And for most of the platforms, the trust gap is more than 30 percentage points. That's the case for messaging apps. That's the case for social media. That's the case for video sites. And in the case of search engines, the trust gap is about 14 percentage points. So somewhere in between the other platforms and the news organizations. Now, as I said, we find no consistent, significant association between relying on any of these types of platforms and how much people know about the disease. This is just, again, showing a slice of the regression model. Those who are interested in details can go to the full report on our website. But as I said before, in Germany, we find that relying on news organizations and the government is significantly associated with knowing more about coronavirus when we ask people factual questions about the disease. We find a significant, relatively sort of small positive association with relying on search engines as well. This is sort of something we find only in Germany and Argentina, so not a consistent pattern. We find nothing for social media and video sites, neither positive nor negative associations. And then a negative association for relying on messaging applications, which is something we also see in the United States. And I think the big takeaway here is that it's clear that all these different platforms to different degrees have very significant problems with different kinds of misinformation, whether it's political, for-profit, or bottom-up misinformation from ordinary citizens, or various, indeed, conspiracy theories and the like. These problems are very real and proliferate across many of these platforms. But it's also clear that the companies know that there is a lot of scrutiny, as there should be, of their role in society, and they're taking various steps to try to rein in misinformation. and also, of course, have decided, somewhat controversially, I should say, to collaborate very closely with authorities to promote and prominently display authoritative information from governments and health authorities. So overall, we find no consistent, significant relationship here across the 6 countries. No evidence that people are sort of outright misinformed by relying on the platforms, but also no consistent evidence that they are informed by relying on the platforms. And in every country, people are quite skeptical of most of these sites as a source of news and information, even as they use them enthusiastically for many other purposes. The final thing I wanted to talk to are the political and social factors. First of all, I think we can think about politics here. This is just an example from the United States because it's such an extreme one that I think it illustrates the point quite clearly. When we look at how much people trust different sources of news and information about the coronavirus and break it down by their political orientation between left, center, and right, what we find in the United States is that everybody say they trust scientists, doctors, and health experts, whether they are on the left or the right politically. And everyone is sort of somewhat skeptical of relying on people that they know for sort of health advice about life and death decisions. But the difference in how people perceive the government and news organizations is very, very pronounced. So people on the left in the United States say they trust news organizations quite a lot, but they trust the federal government less than they trust people that they know. Just think about that for a minute, what that means to live in a country where fewer people on the left would say they trust their own government than say they trust, say, family and friends for advice on such a serious issue as a public health pandemic. And on the right, of course, then we have the opposite picture, which is that people say they trust the government quite a lot. Right-wing government and right-wing Americans rate the government as relatively trustworthy, not as trustworthy as scientists, but still relatively trustworthy on coronavirus. But the contrast here, of course, is that they say they don't trust news organizations very much. So there are fewer people on the right in America who say they trust news organizations as a source of information about coronavirus and say they trust people they know. Again, I think quite a striking and stark picture where more people on the right in the US would rely on their family and friends for information in a life and death situation about a public health crisis and say they are willing to trust information from established news organizations. Of social factors, that's the last point I'll speak to, is that we find, and this is the case in Germany as well, that in addition to the left-right divide, which is very real also in Germany, we also find, again, that people with lower levels of formal education know a little bit less about the disease. This is not a huge difference, but there is an association with education. And then we find that people who say that they don't know, when we ask them where they stand politically, and this is a sizable minority in most countries, 15 to 20%, who say don't know when asked to identify on the left-right spectrum, they know significantly less, much less actually, about the disease than most other people. And again, I think we can interpret this as an example of people who are alienated from mainstream politics and don't really know how to process information because they don't really have anyone that they trust as a source. So I think it's overall a picture where we can show that news media are widely used, often trusted, and that relying on news is positively associated with knowing more about the disease. Digital platforms, a mixed picture, very widely used, not widely trusted, and no consistent association with knowing more, or for that matter, less about the disease. And then these underlying social and political factors that we should just keep in mind all the time will influence the way in which people access and use and process news and information, and should be a reminder that in every society, just as we have people who are vulnerable from an epidemiological point of view, who are more vulnerable because of medical reasons or social inequality, we have a similar situation when it comes to the communication side of this, that the infodemic too will find some communities who are more vulnerable, either because they don't have the resources to access and process information, or because they are so alienated from some of the sources that many others rely on that they won't rely on them and won't trust the information that they get from the news media, or for that matter, from their own government. So with that, I think we'll open up to questions if that works.
Perfect. So I just collected some questions from the internet, and we have one question. So first of all, thanks for the presentation and thanks for the study. And my question comes from Horst Krömers, and he's asking, how is journalism appreciating using the broad expertise of practitioners, individuals, authorities, and representatives of society, not direct from science?
I'm not sure. Sorry, could you repeat that question? I'm not sure.
Sure. The question was, how is journalism appreciating or using that broad experience of practitioners, individuals or authorities or representatives of society? So not direct from science. That was the question. So I'm just reading the question. So if the question was different, Horst, then please ask the question again from the chat. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I don't want to speak to the sort of the details of this, how this looked like in Germany. I don't read enough German news to have an informed view on what this looks like in the case of Germany. What I would say more broadly is that what we see in the markets that I'm more familiar with myself is that I think we can say there's sort of for three broad classes of sources that journalists rely on in this situation. You have scientists and various health experts from health authorities, whether national or international. Then you have a very clear dimension of this that's political, in part about political choices made by elected officials, but also about the sort of interpretation of advice and the translation of scientific expertise into policy decisions. And then you have a wider universe of sources that are often, I think, relied on more to help journalists understand and cover the impact of the crisis in different communities. And here, I think, people rely on civil society leaders for understanding how this plays out in various minority communities. They rely on religious leaders and the like. I haven't seen all that many journalists go to civil society voices for insight on on how to respond to the crisis necessarily. I think that's primarily still something that's indexed very heavily to political sources and to health experts.
So one question was also, will the presentation be for download? And the question is, the answer is yes, we will have your presentation, your study for download later on, and we will share the link underneath the video in the description and also on Twitter and on our website. So from your very own perspective, so how easy is it for journalists to have a report or have a coverage where they decide, okay, a political opinion last week and this week might be a turn of someone made up his mind, but a report where the scientists change their mind is something totally different. So what is your personal perspective on this?
I mean, I want to say, first of all, that I'm full of admiration for the journalists who are trying to cover this story. This is an unprecedented story. It's one that most of us are very ill-equipped to really understand. And I think that a lot of journalists are doing amazing work of trying to make sense of this in real time under very difficult circumstances, often with no ability to contact their sources directly, working from home in lockdown, and often in many organizations also being and the like, because of the financial impact of the crisis on the organization. So I'm full of admiration of the work that most news reporters do on this. I mean, I think there are a couple of different sort of difficult decisions that lots of journalists and editors are struggling a bit with, and I don't want to sort of tell people how to do their jobs, because you can make different decisions about what you feel serves the public interest best. One of them, I think, is this issue of how do you contend with the fact that most of us as individual citizens are used to thinking of science through the experience we have in school, where you're confronted with consensual certainties. This is what the science says. And then the reality that in a complex and fast evolving situation, science is very uncertain, and it's more robust and more reliable than almost probably any other source of knowledge about the crisis. But that doesn't mean that every statement made by every scientist at every point in time is perfect and will never change. When the data changes, then the models will change. That's the very point of science. And I think some journalists have struggled a little bit with how to come to terms with uncertainty. How do you report about this in a way that reflects scientists may know something, but they don't know everything. And not every scientist will always agree on every interpretation or indeed what the best available evidence is. I think there is a similar issue here that's a bit sort of parallel but connected, which is it's clear that politicians, amongst other forms of input, want to rely on science. I think there is also sometimes a tendency that politicians might like to sort of hide behind the science and say, we are just following the science, and try to pretend that science and politics is sort of a zero-sum game where either you take political decisions or you take scientific decisions. And I think we just need to recognize that this is very rarely the way the world works. And almost always you take decisions that are both political and scientific. And I think we can think about analogies to things like the decisions about nuclear power, for example. There is a very advanced and sophisticated science about nuclear power. And if you take political decisions about nuclear power without being informed by that science, you are, taking extreme risks for everyone in your community. But the fact that your political decisions rely in part on the science doesn't mean that there is only one decision you can take. These are very real and complicated trade-offs that politicians have to make. And I think it's sometimes a little bit hard for journalists to sort of be able to disentangle the relative importance of either the science or the politics, also because most journalists are only expert in one of those things, if anything at all of those. And some are generalist reporters who come to this story fresh. And as said, I think many of them are doing a really important job and really amazing job, but it's clear it's really hard to do this on the fly with limited background in the sort of complications of the public health science here.